Welcome, Greek U Nation, to episode number 600 of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Ayalon, CEO of Greek University. I'm a speaker and an author. Our fifth book just came out. It's called Perseverance and How to Be a Great Fraternity or Sorority Alumnus. Go and pick up that book on Amazon or Barnes& Noble today. We call these episodes the Fraternity Foodie Podcast because there is nothing like great food to bring college students together. Fun fact, I am always looking for solutions on this show to some of the most difficult problems that we encounter in society. And I'm not the type of person who's going to shy away from a tough conversation. Now, we all know that gun violence continues to be a problem in this country. We must find answers to protect our citizens, to protect our students, and to protect our places of worship. This episode is going to tackle this very issue. Jeff Wenninger is a nationally recognized law enforcement expert with 33 years of experience, most notably as a lieutenant with the LA Police Department. He has dedicated his career to understanding and improving police practices, specializing in police use of force, crowd management and control, school and campus safety, and security protection measures. He just released a new book. It's called On Thin Ice, an LAPD veteran's journey to reimagine policing. So I immediately wanted to bring him back onto the show to talk about this new book. Now, he is the founder and CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants, LLC. There, he provides clear and practical expert testimony and consulting services. He uses all of his extensive experience to help legal professionals, cities, schools, and more to navigate the complexities of law enforcement in today's challenging environment. Jeff's goal is to boost public trust and safety by offering straightforward, actionable advice and ensuring objectivity in every assessment. Welcome back to the show, Jeff.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It is an honor to have you on the show, and your expertise now, I think, is more important than ever, to be quite honest with you, Jeff. Let's start talking about your new book. Let's just jump right in. It's called On Thin Ice, an LAPD Veteran's Journey to Reimagine Policing. I read the book. It's absolutely fascinating. So I was happy to give a testimony on the book because everybody should really go out and pick up this book right now. Now, the interesting thing is you actually never intended to become a police officer. Can you take us back to that pivotal moment in Kent, Ohio, and how did that change your entire life?
Well, like you said, never intended on being a police officer. If you would have told me when I was 18 years old that I would do a 33-year career in law enforcement, I would have told you were crazy, especially doing it in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
I would have never seen that occurring. But I went to college on a college scholarship. I was a Division I collegiate ice hockey player. And on a Friday night, it was Labor Day weekend, I went out to a local college bar with a teammate. And we closed the bar. And when we were leaving with all the other students, and we were going out onto a sidewalk that was not designed to hold all the students that were exiting the bar. So a number of us flowed out into the street. And my friend, he thought it would be cute to jump up on the hood of a vehicle that was trying to navigate its way through the crowd. It was full of, three attractive young ladies. And back then we didn't have cell phones or social media. So when you saw something you liked, you approached it in the manner in which he did, which was unfortunate because when he did so, the girl driving didn't appreciate it. And when she slammed on the brakes, he fell off and he snapped the antenna off the hood of the car. And there was a police officer straight up the way that saw what occurred. And he came down, grabbed my buddy, handcuffed him, threw him in the back seat of the police car. And I thought, well, we got the buddy system. I need to find out where they're taking him, how long it's going to take to process, and what it's going to cost for me to get him out of jail. And the police officer was very belligerent with me. And in so many terms, he said, get back up on the sidewalk or you're going to jail as well. So I did that. Well, in the meantime, he called for backup. The backup arrived. And one of them was a sergeant. So I thought, well, that was some relief to me. I thought, well, this will bring some common sense to this situation and some logic. But I couldn't have been more wrong. When he asked me for identification, as I reached for it, he began to beat me. And there's two officers that responded, beat me, and it wasn't long before I was in the backseat of a police car en route down to the city jail, where I was booked for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and interfering in official business. Now, to make this even crazier, when I'm down there, I asked where my buddy was, and they said that they had released him. And here I was being arrested and charged for having done nothing more than inquire on how I could help my buddy. And so I spent the weekend in jail, and I ended up spending my entire summer's earnings on an attorney because I refused to take any of the plea deals. And I took it all the way to a jury trial. And when I showed up, they offered me the opportunity if I signed this ticket for $60 fine, they would drop all three charges, which I did. And about a year and a half later, it just happened that the police department that arrested me put an advertisement in the paper for correction officers in the very jail that I sat in for that entire weekend. And I went ahead and I applied, kind of out of a joke. I didn't expect anything really to happen. Well, I got hired. And that's right there is the ultimate exoneration of any wrongdoing. But it was that experience that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I I considered going to law school, but a good family friend of ours, I'm dyslexic, so I struggled academically. They said, well, you'd have a hard time getting into a robust law school. You'd probably go to what's considered a law school factory, and you'll be just a dime a dozen, one of a million. So bad advice, but it was advice I took at the time. And I thought, how better to impact law enforcement than to actively be involved with the boots on the ground from internally within the profession itself. And I went out to Los Angeles really to do about 5 years. I wanted to be a professor and follow my father into academia. He was a sociology professor at Kent State. And well, 5 years turned into 33. So here we are.
It's amazing how these like twists and turns in life take us where they want us to go. And sometimes it's a little bit out of our control once the ball gets rolling, right? It's so interesting to me because, as you know, many of our listeners, they're college students. And I think that there are some, how should I say, misunderstandings about the police from a college student perspective. So, what do police often misunderstand about college students?
Well, it's not just college students just in themselves. It's about education. It's
Yeah,
about higher education.
yeah.
And it's kind of frightening. You have the number of law enforcement officers that have 4-year degrees or higher is rather low. And that's important. And I say, why is that important? The reality is that the research has demonstrated that officers that have 4-year college education levels or higher have 40% lower incidence of force as
Mhm.
well as complaints. It's a significant statistical thing that needs to be considered in regards to how we're hiring.
Yeah.
And in law enforcement, you're seeing like Dallas just recently eliminated their educational requirement for hiring. So the standards aren't necessarily consistent with what we would want to see in law enforcement officers relative to an educational level. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have a 4-year degree or a master's degree to be a good police officer. That's not what I'm saying. But we can't ignore the fact that education is important because it's really about the bottom line is that our attitudes and beliefs impact our actions and behaviors.
Mm.
And where are we going to get this ability to have critical thinking skills, problem solving skills, develop stronger levels of empathy and having compassion for various scenarios and being open-minded and willing to accept the type of training that we may be getting. Training does not begin until you're willing to accept that training. And it's really important that you have people that have the characteristics that are indicative of somebody that's going to be successful as a law enforcement officer. And education tends to be the path towards that.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating conversation. Interestingly enough, I have my master's degree in public service management from Cumberland University. And in my class, there were a ton of police officers. Basically, it was kind of this relationship that existed between the university and the local police department to bring them closer together. And they offered all kinds of scholarships and made it really easy for the officers to participate in the program. And I remember graduating with a bunch of them, and I thought it was great for everybody. I think it helped to create that common understanding between the public and law enforcement and some of the challenges that exist between them. And I think it got us to a better place. So I think that model that they have at Cumberland University, I think is something that should be looked at. And I think more universities should open the doors for law enforcement to come back to school, get their 4-year degree, get their master's degree in public service. And I think some really unique things happened as a result of that, to bring both of these parties closer together. So something to think about. Now, you wrote candidly about the abuse of power and also the us versus them mindset that exists in law enforcement. Why is that mindset so dangerous, especially when we're talking about college campuses?
Well, it's really dangerous because like I just spoke about, it's your attitudes and beliefs are going to impact your actions and behaviors.
Mhm.
And it's really important that you base things on your understanding of groups. Unfortunately, law enforcement responds to calls where people are having probably the worst day of their lives. And we tend to, unfortunately, if we don't keep ourselves objective about the communities in which we're policing, we tend to then, over time, paint everybody with a broad brush. And the reality is the vast majority of people are good people. And it's a small, small percentage of our society that is actually the criminal element. And that's where it breaks down. And if you don't maintain an open mind about the influences on various communities in which you are policing and have an understanding of them, then you're not going to be very effective in your role because it's really about partnerships. And you can't have partnerships unless you have understanding. I've always said it's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And you have to be open to people that have conflicting opinions and be open to having planned as well as unplanned creative encounters where you're going to have robust dialogue and be willing to work through some issues where it's not going to be seen exactly how you may particularly see it. And that's really what's important. That's what my book is really all about. I don't for a second assert that I have all of the answers. But I'm being honest about what my experience were in law enforcement and where I see the deficiencies as being, and in looking outside of the insular culture of law enforcement to other countries and seeing what they're doing to hopefully have some type of an idea of what we perhaps could take as bits and pieces of what's successful with them and try to implement it here to our policing in this country. And that's where the success needs to occur. So whether you're on a college campus or you're in a large municipal city of over 1 million people, or you're in a community of 10,000, it's still the same type of mentality that you have to have where you don't have all the answers as a law enforcement entity. You need to be looking outward to see what other solutions are there to help you manifest a plan forward to have success moving forward in the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, I've certainly noticed that nobody has all the right answers. We need each other. I think that's the bottom line. And we also can't ignore some of the racial divides that are happening in this country. I'm wondering what role did your upbringing in a multiracial, progressive family, how did that play in shaping all of your views on justice and equity within policing?
Well, like you said, I grew up in a multiracial family. I was adopted, and I have a brother who was adopted. He's Japanese, and I
Mm.
had a foster sister who was black. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Kent, Ohio. And my folks were wonderful people. They were far ahead of their time, and they're very civically minded. But, it wasn't that I experienced things that were like overtly horrible that would be noteworthy of media attention or that sort of thing. It's the little micro racism that occurs where it's kind of like the dripping water on a rock. It just erodes slowly. It's the things that occur with the veneer of a smile, where you do sense what's going on. And the reality is people think, "Oh, that's not harmful." Well, it is. It impacts communities, it impacts people's relationships and ability to interact and be just have a robust, healthy environment to be raised in. And even though I grew up in Kent, Ohio, which at the time was considered to be a rather progressive community, I saw firsthand, racism. And it made me have a completely different lens in which I looked at my law enforcement career. I was I was just more keenly aware of how little things impact the larger scale of an interaction.
Mhm.
And I just oftentimes saw that my peers lacked that insight.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that insight. I think that's really helpful because, you also served during the Rodney King riots. You've served in elite tactical units. You've investigated officer-involved shootings. I'm wondering, were there any moments in there that challenged your integrity? And how were you able to hold the line?
Well, throughout my entire career, it's really hard to pinpoint one moment in time.
Yeah.
So from the beginning of my career as a police officer working the streets, all the way through my promotions up to lieutenant when I was overseeing the officer-involved shooting team that investigated those types of incidents. It really was required of me to stand by my values, and not compromise them. And although I was oftentimes, my position was not well received by my peers or the institution, or there perhaps was even, a price to be paid for the position that I held. You have to have the courage to stand by what you know to be true and right,
Mm,
and you have to stand by that. And over time, I found that in the moment that I was taking a position, it may not have resonated with those around me, but in time, it did.
mm,
So the progress did occur. Progress sometimes occurs it's a slow turning ship at sea, but it is turning.
mm.
And you just can't be discouraged by the speed bumps that you're going to have along the way. So it's really hard for me to pinpoint it because throughout my career, we could spend this entire time talking about the various speed bumps that I had to tend to navigate. But it's just really, I think it's just important that you believe in who you are and you believe in your value system and you stand true to your convictions. And that's where you can have the greatest impact over time.
Yeah, well, that's an important lesson, I think, for our listeners because many of them, are being taught these values through their fraternity or sorority, through their parents, through educators on a college campus, through their religion. All of these places, they're able to take those values and what's important to them. And we want them to stay true to those values and to think about those values when they're making decisions. And so the fact that you were able to do that, I think, speaks volumes for our undergraduate students. You talk about reimagine policing, and I'm wondering how is that concept different from reform or some of those claims to defund the police? How is that different?
Well, yeah, I think words have consequences. And when you hear the term reform or defund the police, I can tell you, having been a law enforcement professional, that oftentimes is offensive to those that are within the profession. And they're going to be immediately defensive and put up the walls. So you're not going to be able to make the progress. And reimagine policing, what that is essentially saying is that law enforcement as a profession has the ability to actually dictate and navigate its own future and has the opportunity to establish what successes they're going to have moving forward. It's not about having things imposed on you. It's about taking control and holding those reins and directing where the law enforcement profession is going to go into the future. So I think it's just a much more productive way to look at it.
Mm,
And it's about having the conversations with the people within law enforcement as well as outside of law enforcement and determining what is the best path forward. Because there's a lot of answers that are out there. Unfortunately, law enforcement tends to be quite insular. And when I say insular, not just as a profession, but as an entity where the organizations are resistant to look outside of even themselves to see what lessons need to be learned from various incidents. There's all kinds of, you can just look at these incidents that have occurred on college campuses as of late. There's all kinds of lessons that can be learned
Mm.
relative to campus security and safety. And if you're not taking that opportunity to dissect those and learn from them and implement strategies to ensure that the same thing doesn't happen on your campus, then you're being complacent. And complacency will always not end well.
Yeah, well, I 100% agree with you. I believe in learning from past incidents. I pull out the newspaper and I show the articles to the students about things that have happened on college campuses and what do we need to do to prevent this from happening? Like, here's actual names, here's mugshots, the whole thing. Like, what do we need to do to prevent this from happening here? And I think that that is really important to give names, to give context, and to talk about how we can approach the situation differently. And in the book, you talk about building a better cop. What does that training look like? I'm wondering what we should be teaching officers that we're not currently teaching them.
Well, listen, I think you'd be shocked, and your listeners would be shocked to know how little training police officers actually get. And a law enforcement officer, there is no national standard for policing. So police academies, they range from having 9 months before you hit the streets as a police officer to having no requirement whatsoever in Hawaii. The average number of hours of training for a police academy is 800 hours. And to put that in context, to get your cosmetology license, you need 1,500 hours. So nearly twice. So, so just look at firearms training. Only 1% of officers in the United States are required to fire their weapons at the range every month. 60% of officers are only required to fire 1 to 2 times a year.
Wow, that's a lot.
25% of law enforcement officers don't get any training in don't shoot scenarios. 42% don't get any training in tactical de-escalation. And so this perception that officers are these highly trained individuals, it's just not true. And that's a reality that law enforcement has to face. And we need to confront that and address that appropriately. There was a study done here in Ohio. They looked at 300 law enforcement agencies and they wanted to look at the compliance to the mandatory ongoing training of the officers. Only 5 agencies were in compliance out of the 300. So that's a responsibility that law enforcement has, not only at the state level, because they're the ones that certify officers to have their authority within each state. But it's each organization has to be a little more, do their due diligence to ensure that this training is actually occurring.
Mm.
Oftentimes it's just the honor system, and it's obviously not working.
Right. Yeah, that training is obviously just not sufficient at all. You know, unbelievable to me. Okay, and there we've seen several examples, unfortunately, of policing failures. I look at Uvalde. I think that is certainly one example. There's various other cities that we can talk about on school grounds. What lessons should college campus police or the public safety on college campus, what should they learn or take from these tragedies?
Well, like I spoke of earlier, it's really important to look at these incidents. And I've investigated over 700 officer involved shootings. And there is not one incident where there's not an ability to identify things that we could do better. And it's important to learn by the mistakes of others, not only others within your own organization, but the mistakes of other organizations. One of the things that really upset me the most was when we saw the Tyree Nichols beating and killing in Memphis, Tennessee. What I saw when I watched those videos was I saw violations of things that we had corrected 2 decades earlier in Los Angeles. And I'm like, how could it be possible for a large law enforcement agency within this country to have not learned the hard lessons that we had learned 2 decades prior? So it's really important to dissect these things and reach out and try to determine the best path forward relative to the lessons learned and identifying not only the things that can be improved upon, but what was done well. So we want to emulate that again in the future. But most importantly, identify those things that you can improve upon. And it's really incumbent upon everybody to do that. Unfortunately, law enforcement, how often do we see them patting themselves on their back, breaking their arms, talking about how well they responded to something when it's still fresh and we have all kinds of families that have lost loved ones and things. And it's we need to start focusing on what we're really there to do, which is to serve the public in the best manner we possibly can. And that requires that we learn from every incident, whether it's within our own organization or it's an incident that occurs outside of our organization.
Hmm. I think we have to be honest in that a lot of times on these college campuses, there's almost this adversarial relationship that exists between law enforcement and some of the students, specifically fraternities and sororities, because they're out there trying to have a good time. What role can our fraternities and sororities play in terms of building better relationships with law enforcement and also holding them accountable when things don't go right?
Well, I think it's really important that you understand as a student at a university that you are part of a community. You're essentially a little city. And policing is only as good as the relationships that the law enforcement agency has with the communities that they serve. And it's not a one-way street. Oftentimes, people want to complain about law enforcement, but they're also not willing to extend their hand and say, let's work together. And really, a lot of the stuff that can help law enforcement is what universities can provide, which is research data, empirical evidence that can help law enforcement navigate how best to move forward. And it's about creating these things. A little history lesson here. A lot of people don't realize this, but Teddy Roosevelt, prior to becoming the president of the United States, 26th president of the United States, he was the police commissioner of New York City Police Department. And he took over a department that was just riddled with corruption and partisanship and inefficiency and lack of accountability. And he looked at the path forward in creating a law enforcement agency that was more honest and that was more efficient. And one thing, the key thing that I'm going to mention here is technologically advanced. This was in the late 1800s. But listen, that is not changed. And the one thing that I would talk about here is like how, as university students, can we help law enforcement help us? One of the things that is most prevalent on college campuses is sexual assaults. And the reality is on college campuses, only about 10% are reported. And that's lower than the general population. About 1 in 3 in the general population are reported. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And the reality is, it's shocking that the vast majority of cases that are reported, only about 1 in 3 of those end in an arrest, and even fewer of those end in a conviction. Now, I'm going to read this because I don't want to get this wrong.
Mhm.
But there was a study that was done. Out of 1,000 sexual assaults, only 384 were reported. 57 led to arrest. 11 of those of the 57 that were arrested were prosecuted, and there were 7 convictions. Now, why is that? That's because students don't feel that the perpetrator is going to be held accountable and that there's not systems in place to help care for the victims.
Mhm.
That's why. So what has our research demonstrated is the biggest hurdle in having prosecutions, holding people accountable, and having successful prosecutions that lead to convictions? It's the initial report. Now, we've already talked about the deficient training of law enforcement.
Mhm.
Trust me, they're very deficient in their understanding of sexual assault, in knowing how to properly interview a victim and gather the evidence necessary to have a report that's going to lead to a strong, robust prosecution. So, technology, here we are. Look at what we've done with technology. You can take a 400-page, court ruling and narrow it down to 300 pages through AI. Why can't we have AI where we have programs on a computer that can be open when the officer's interviewing the victim and it's listening and it's prompting the officer to the next question?
Mhm.
So making the reports more robust, making sure that the proper questions are being asked, making sure the officers aren't misinterpreting what's being said and perceiving something as, oh, that's evidence that this is not really a strong case, or this isn't what it is, because of their lack of understanding how the psychological and mental impact of being a sexual assault victim may be. But it's those sorts of things that university students would best understand and be able to create a program that could help assist law enforcement. So it's about thinking outside the box and taking control of helping law enforcement help you. And I just felt I just feel that's a real important example, because it is something that's so prevalent on college campuses.
Yeah, it really is something that's very prevalent on college campuses, and we just don't have any solutions yet. But you're bringing up a bunch of ideas that I think would be very helpful in terms of using artificial intelligence to create better reports. Perhaps some partnerships that could exist between survivors of sexual assaults and those police departments. There are a lot of advocates that would love to partner with police departments to help those reports and get more convictions, because I think ultimately we're all on the same team here. And if we have people who are committing sexual assaults that go free and continue that behavior, that's not helping society at all. So getting those convictions, I think, is incredibly important. And I agree with you. I think AI is a great tool to help us get there. The other thing that I think about too, that I wanted to talk to you about is we're seeing a lot of the National Guard being deployed into cities in the United States. And you and I both know that that's not necessarily what we envision when we think about the National Guard. When we think about the National Guard, we think about going abroad, and basically, essentially, missions that are, unfortunately, people are going to get killed in other countries. But now we're putting the National Guard into cities in the United States, cities like Detroit, cities like Memphis and Tennessee. What concerns do you have in terms of policing that is done by the National Guard, who typically has a very different mission than police officers?
Well, listen, I think you have to ask the question, is it about power? Is it about justice? Or is it about humanity? And I was born in the mid 60s, and my father was a sociology professor at Kent State. I remember May 4th, 1970, where you had the students at Kent State University were demonstrating the Vietnam War, where the escalation of the war, of the deployment of resources into Cambodia, incited these demonstrations. And the answer to that was deploying the National Guard on campus. And it resulted in 67 rounds being fired, 4 students unarmed being killed, and 9 others injured, one permanently paralyzed. My father was standing on Johnson Hall, which is a dormitory just over the shoulders of the National Guardsmen that were knelt down when they fired. There's a photo, you can actually see my father standing there.
Hmm.
And throughout my life, Kent was forever changed because of that incident. And I had a number of conversations with my father about accountability, about trust, and about what the best path forward is. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he was developing my critical thinking skills, because he never told me what he thought.
Hmm.
He just asked that I consider certain things and then I articulate my opinion and provide my rationale for that opinion. So Kent State really was the catalyst of this conversation. What role, if any, should the National Guard have in civilian policing? And I would suggest that the role that they are allowed to fulfill based on the authority that they have when they're being deployed in these cities, which is logistical and administrative type functions, is not consistent with what we're hearing in the political rhetoric relative to they are responsible for reducing the crime. Yes, their presence is going to reduce crime in the immediacy of the here and now,
Hmm.
but it's about what my father said. What is the long-term solution? What long-term impact is this going to have? Is it actually going to deteriorate the trust in the sense of accountability between the community and the police department that serves them? Those are the types of questions we have to be asking ourselves as a society. And the reality is I don't believe anybody wants to live in a policed state where the military are functioning in that role.
No.
I'm I personally take offense to the fact that law enforcement is being deemed as inefficient. The reality is this: Trump has defunded the police more than anybody has. We're defunded about $850 million
Hmm.
relative to the training programs and the grants for that. The things that I've talked about and emphasized are significantly deficient in American policing, as well as hiring of officers. So they're saying that by deploying the National Guard, they can fill these logistical positions as well as the administrative positions, giving the law enforcement officers the ability, therefore, to go out and handle the crime, which I would suggest is consistent with a staffing model that I discuss in my book, where we need to more civilianize our departments and stop using sworn personnel to perform functions that their training does not require them. You don't need that type of training to do those tasks.
Hmm.
We can be a leaner law enforcement agency as far as our sworn personnel, as if we are willing to accept the fact that we can be more efficient if we employ civilian people, not only in roles that would be administrative and logistical, but also in command staff, because it's about their mindset, opinions, experience, expertise that can be brought to the table when judgments and decisions are being made at the highest levels within law enforcement agencies. So, to be honest with you, I think if anything that this deployment is it underscores what I'm emphasizing, that we need to more strongly civilianize our law enforcement to make our people that are trained as law enforcement officers and have the authority to perform as law enforcement officers, give them the ability to focus on what they need to be focusing on, and that is reducing crime.
Yeah. Fascinating conversation, fascinating book. Get that book over to the White House, please, before we deploy more National Guards in American cities. I think it's really, really critical stuff. And by the way, your dad was a brilliant professor. I can tell you that already. I've never met the man in my life, but I can tell you that the way that he approached teaching and the way that he taught you is exactly the right way to do it, which is not to impose his own thoughts on you, but rather just to understand your rationale and understand your thinking and make sure you're able to defend your position, whatever your position may be. That's a brilliant professor, and man, awesome, awesome. He raised a great kid, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Awesome. All right, so where can our students go to buy your book, potentially to bring you in to speak on their college campus? The book again is called On Thin Ice: An LAPD Veteran's Journey to Reimagine Policing. Where can they go to buy the book and then connect with you?
Well, you can find it at Amazon or Barnes and Noble. You can go to onthinicebook.com. It comes in three platforms. You can get it in hardcover, paperback, or Kindle. And if you're interested in any of my writings, you can find me on LinkedIn, Jeff Wenninger on LinkedIn, as well as Facebook. I write a number of articles that get published, and I write a number of blogs on all of these issues that we've been talking about, as well as others that are really, really pressing right now and are current in regards to the issues that we're facing here in the United States and law enforcement's role in those issues. So As far as speaking, you can go to jeffwenninger.com and you can fill out a form and inquire about my availability to speak on college campuses or to law enforcement professionals or any venue, actually. I'll speak to anybody that's willing to listen because I really believe that my message that I'm trying to expound in my book is very important. The goal is to generate dialogue of these very difficult conversations that oftentimes law enforcement avoids. And it's about the law enforcement being successful. I bleed blue. I love law enforcement. I want law enforcement to be successful. I want law enforcement to dictate and navigate its successful path forward. But it's going to require that these difficult conversations occur. And and I hope that my book prompts them and that that we'll see some successful outcomes in the future.
Yeah, there's no doubt that it will, and we will get those successful outcomes that you seek. And you and I are alike in so many different ways. I love dearly the fraternity and sorority community, and I believe in those values that we're teaching college students. But also, we have to have some difficult conversations about some of the realities around things like alcohol and drug abuse, or hazing, or sexual assaults, as we've talked about here in this episode. I think there are some difficult conversations to be had. I love fraternity and sorority, but I also will have difficult conversations that I think we need to own. So I appreciate your perspective. I think it's very timely in terms of what's happening in our country today in terms of policing. So thank you very much for writing the book. Thank you very much for appearing on our show. I think this conversation is incredibly important. So thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And if you want to contact Jeff, again, just go to his website, jeffwenninger.com. His last name is spelled Wenninger, the founder and CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants, LLC. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it, make sure that you like it on social media and share it with other college students on your campus that would find Jeff to be interesting and certainly very needed today. Thanks so much. We'll see you on the next episode of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. Bye for now.